The hiss of the steam engine was a dying man's last breath, a sound that surrendered to the vast, baked silence of the Arizona Territory. The train, a long black serpent with its skin scoured by sun and sand, shuddered to a halt. Its iron wheels groaned against the track. The only music in a town that God had seemingly carved from rock and dust and then forgotten. Dry Hollow wasn't a place for the hopeful. It was a place for endings. From one of the passenger cars, a woman descended the steep iron steps. She moved with a cautious grace, her hand hovering just above the rail as if she expected it to burn her. Her dress was the color of a faded cornflower, plain and practical. Yet, on her, it held a certain elegance that was painfully out of place. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, was pale and fine-boned. But it was her eyes that held the territory's emptiness. They were the color of a stormy sky, wide and haunted, carrying a story she had no intention of telling. This was Lillian, a mail-order bride who had traveled 2,000 miles to shed her past like a snake sheds its skin, claiming to have no family, no history, nothing but a name and a contract. Waiting on the warped planks of the station platform stood a man built like a barrel cactus, stout, thick, and prickly. Thomas Briggs was 20 years her senior, his face a roadmap of sun wrinkles and scowling habits. A thick, graying mustache covered a mouth that was perpetually turned down at the corners. He checked the silver watch chained to his vest, his impatience a palpable thing in the shimmering heat. He was a man of property, a rancher whose land stretched to the foot of the distant mesas, a man who held sway with the local law and whose temper was as sudden and violent as a summer flash flood. He saw her, and his eyes narrowed, not with welcome, but with appraisal, like a cattleman inspecting new stock. Leaning against a support pillar of the general store across the street, another man watched the scene unfold. Caleb Ward hadn't come to town to gawk. He was there for a sack of flour and a box of cartridges. But the train's arrival was an event, and he had paused, rolling a cigarette with calloused, steady fingers. He was a rancher, too, but his land was harder, his herd smaller, his face leaner. His eyes, the color of worn denim, missed nothing. He had known Thomas Briggs for years, had seen the cruelty in the way he handled his horses and his hired men. Now, he saw Briggs step forward as Lillian reached the bottom step. The older man didn't offer a hand. He took her arm, his grip firm, proprietary. Caleb saw the woman flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, a flicker of something dark in her gaze before she cast it to the ground. It was nothing, a small thing that no one else would have noticed. But Caleb noticed, and a cold knot formed in his gut. Something was wrong. It wasn't the woman. It was the man she had come to marry. Briggs loaded her single, small trunk onto the back of his wagon himself, a display of strength that was more threat than courtesy. He gestured for her to climb onto the seat, his voice a low rumble. "The ride to my place is a long one. You don't say much, do you?" Lillian merely shook her head, her eyes fixed on her own hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. Caleb lit his cigarette, the smoke a thin gray ribbon in the still air. He watched the wagon rattle down the dusty main street, watched the slight, straight figure of the woman until she was nothing more than a speck against the endless, brutal horizon. He had a feeling he was watching a lamb being led to a slaughterhouse. The dinner at Briggs's ranch that evening was a lesson in silent terror. The house was large, built of solid timber, but it was as cold and unwelcoming as a tomb. The long dining table was polished to a high sheen, but the chairs were hard and straight-backed. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floors, nothing to soften the stark masculinity of the place. The only other person at the table was Sheriff Miller, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest and whose loyalty was bought and paid for by Briggs's whiskey and influence. Briggs carved the roast with heavy, deliberate strokes of the knife. He talked at length about his land, the purity of his cattle's bloodline, and the trouble he'd had with rustlers. He addressed his words to the sheriff, ignoring Lillian completely, as if she were a piece of furniture he had recently acquired. Lillian sat perfectly still, her back ramrod straight, her plate untouched. She had changed into another simple dress, this one a somber gray, and she looked like a ghost at the feast. "She's a quiet one, ain't she?" the sheriff remarked, gesturing toward Lillian with a half-eaten chicken leg. Briggs grunted. "I didn't pay for conversation. I paid for a wife. A wife knows her duties. She'll learn." He reached over and placed a heavy hand on Lillian's shoulder. It happened in an instant. Her entire body went rigid. A small, choked sound escaped her throat, and she flinched away from his touch with such violence that her chair scraped backward on the wooden floor. Her eyes, wide with a primal fear, flew to his face for the first time that evening. Briggs' expression hardened, his good humor vanishing like a puff of smoke. He snatched his hand back. "What in God's name is the matter with you, girl?" he snarled. "Nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze dropped back to her lap. I was startled. Forgive me." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. Briggs glared at her, his jaw working. The rest of the meal passed in a thick, suffocating silence. Lillian didn't look up again. She didn't touch her food. She just sat there, a porcelain doll braced for the moment it would be shattered. Later that night, the moon was a silver sliver in a black sky. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods that lined the creek at the edge of Briggs' property. It was that creek that served as the border between his land and Caleb Ward's. Caleb was out, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Checking a fence line he suspected a coyote had been testing. The air was cool and clean, a relief after the day's oppressive heat. He heard it first, a faint rustle in the undergrowth, followed by a sob so raw and full of despair. It made the hair on his arm stand up. He froze, listening. It came again, closer this time. He moved toward the sound, his boots making no noise on the soft earth. He found her huddled at the base of a large sycamore, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her gray dress was torn at the shoulder, and a dark, ugly bruise was blooming on her cheekbone. She had been running, blindly, desperately, with no destination in mind other than away. He didn't speak, not at first. He simply stood there, a tall, silent shadow in the moonlight. She didn't see him until he was only a few feet away. When she did, she scrambled backward, crab-walking through the dirt and leaves, her eyes wild with panic. "Stay back," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "Please." Caleb stopped. He held up his hands, showing they were empty. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're on my land now. You're safe." Her terror didn't subside. It was a deep, ingrained thing, something she had been living with for a long time. Tears streamed down her face, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "You don't understand," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a broken rush. He thinks he owns me, but he can't. Not me. I'm not who I pretended to be. I'm not anyone." The confession hung in the air, a desperate, cryptic admission of a life she had tried to bury. Caleb didn't ask what she meant. The bruise on her face and the terror in her eyes told him everything he needed to know for now. He slowly shrugged off the heavy wool blanket he had tied behind his saddle. He took a step forward, laid it gently on the ground in front of her, and then backed away again. "It gets cold out here at night," he said simply. She stared at the blanket, then at him, her breathing still ragged. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the instinct to flee warring with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and pulled the blanket toward her, wrapping it around her shivering shoulders. "My cabin's not far," he said. "It's small, but it's warm. You can rest there." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she was following. He knew that any pressure, any hint of force, would send her running again. After a few paces, He heard the soft fall of her footsteps behind him. His cabin was a one-room affair. Built with his own 2 hands, it smelled of pine wood, coffee, and gun oil. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire casting flickering shadows across the room. There was a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot in the corner. It was a Spartan existence, but it was his. He gestured toward the cot. "You can take that." She looked from the cot to him, a question in her eyes. "I'll take the chair by the fire," he said, answering the unspoken fear. She hesitated for only a moment before moving to the cot and lying down, pulling the blanket tight around her. She turned her face to the wall, a small, wounded creature seeking the safety of darkness. Caleb added another log to the fire and sat down in the worn wooden chair. He didn't sleep. He sat awake through the long, quiet hours of the night, his rifle across his lap, watching over the stranger in his cabin, a silent sentinel guarding her broken peace. The sun was a fiery orange ball on the horizon when Caleb rode into Dry Hollow the next morning. He had left Lillian sleeping, the deep, exhausted sleep of someone who hadn't known a moment's rest in days, or maybe years. He had left a pot of coffee on the stove and a piece of bread on the table. He knew this day would bring a reckoning. He found Briggs coming out of the saloon, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. When he saw Caleb, his eyes narrowed into slits. "You," Briggs spat. "You've got something of mine." "She's not a piece of property." "Briggs," Caleb said, his voice level, his hands resting on his thighs, deliberately far from the pistol at his hip. "She's my wife. I've got a contract, signed and sealed. The law is on my side. You're harboring a runaway ward. That's a crime in this territory." He took a step closer, jabbing a thick finger at Caleb's chest. "You bring her back now, and I'll forget this happened. You don't, and I'll have Sheriff Miller clap you in irons before noon." Caleb's jaw tightened. He thought of the bruise on Lillian's face, of the sound of her sobbing in the dark. "She's not going back to you." Briggs laughed, a short, ugly sound. "She will. She's got nowhere else to go. A woman like that, all alone. She needs a man to look after her, to discipline her." That was the word that did it. Discipline. Caleb's control snapped. He didn't say another word. His fist shot out, a hard, fast blow that caught Briggs square on the jaw. The bigger man staggered backward, surprise and pain flashing in his eyes, before his legs gave out and he crashed to the ground in a heap. Townspeople stopped in their tracks. Doors opened. The saloon emptied out. In Dry Hollow, a public fight was high entertainment. Caleb stood over Briggs, his chest heaving, his knuckles aching. Before he could do anything else, a firm hand gripped his shoulder. "That's enough. Caleb." It was Sheriff Miller. He hauled Caleb back a step while 2 other men helped a dazed and furious Briggs to his feet. "He assaulted me!" Briggs roared, spitting a glob of blood into the dust. "I want him arrested." The sheriff looked from Briggs's bleeding lip to Caleb's cold, hard face. He sighed, looking like a man caught between a rock and a hard place. He pulled Caleb aside, away from the gathering crowd. "You know I can't ignore this. Caleb," he said, his voice low. "You can't just go around punching folks in the street, no matter how much they deserve it." He paused, leaning in closer. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you need to listen to me. This ain't about the fight. It's about the girl." Caleb said nothing, just watched him. "I did some checking," the sheriff continued, his eyes darting around nervously. "After Briggs told me she'd run off, I sent a telegraph to the authorities back east. A woman fitting her description. Lillian. She's got a file. An arrest warrant out of Cook County. Illinois. Theft. Vagrancy. She's trouble. Caleb. The kind of trouble that gets a man tangled up with the law in ways he can't get out of. You need to walk away from this now, before it's too late." The world seemed to tilt under Caleb's feet. An arrest warrant. It explained the haunted look in her eyes, the desperation. She wasn't just running from Briggs, she was running from everything. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder. "Go home, Caleb. Sleep it off. Forget you ever saw her." But Caleb couldn't forget. He couldn't forget the feel of Briggs's jaw connecting with his fist. And he couldn't forget the weight of the secret the sheriff had just handed him. He turned without a word, swung himself up onto his horse, and rode out of town, the dust swirling behind him. He rode hard, the rhythmic beat of his horse's hooves a counterpoint to the turmoil in his mind. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange, purple, and gold. The world was awash in a beautiful, dying light. Lillian was standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm glow from the cabin's interior. She was wearing one of his own shirts. It was far too big for her. The sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She had washed her face, and her dark hair was unbound, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked younger, more fragile than ever. She saw him approaching, and her body tensed, her hands twisting the fabric of the shirt. She was ready to apologize, to explain, to bargain, to run. Caleb swung down from his horse and walked toward her, his spurs jingling softly with each step. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of her, so close he could see the apprehension in her stormy eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, the words already forming on her lips. I'm sorry for the—" He didn't let her finish. He raised a hand, not to strike, but to gently cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the unbruised side of her face, and then, as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of purpose. It was slow, deliberate, a silencing of all the words that stood between them. It was a brand, a promise, a declaration made without a single sound. He tasted the fear on her lips and the faintest hint of hope underneath. He held the kiss for a long moment, pouring all of his resolve, all of his defiance against Briggs and the law and her own dark past, into that single profound gesture. When he finally pulled back, her eyes were wide, her lips parted in surprise. Before she could find her voice, he turned, strode back to his horse, and mounted up. He rode straight back to Dry Hollow, the twilight deepening around him. He didn't stop until he reached the sheriff's office. The lamp was lit inside. He dismounted, pushed the door open, and walked in. Sheriff Miller was sitting behind his desk, cleaning a pistol. He looked up, his expression wary. Caleb didn't waste time with greetings. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick canvas envelope, heavy with the sale of 2 prize bulls he had been saving for a hard winter. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. The sheriff stared at the envelope, then up at Caleb. "Forget everything about her," Caleb said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Forget her name. Forget that warrant. Forget you ever heard of a woman named Lillian arriving in my part of this territory." Sheriff Miller slowly reached out and touched the envelope, weighing its promise. He looked into Caleb Ward's unwavering eyes and knew this was a line being drawn in the sand, a bargain being struck in the shadows. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The deal was done. The past was for sale. Lillian awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the unfamiliar weight of silence. The morning light, soft and pale, filtered through the single window of the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to place where she was. The cot was narrow, the blanket coarse against her skin. This was not Thomas Briggs' house. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. Caleb was gone. In his place, on the small wooden table, sat a tin plate with a thick slice of bread, a canteen of water, and a piece of paper, folded neatly and weighted down with a smooth, gray stone. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The handwriting was stark and masculine, The letters formed with a heavy, deliberate hand. "You can stay as long as you need. There is food in the pantry. The goats need milking. Don't go near the Briggs place." There was no signature. None was needed. The words were simple, direct, an offer of sanctuary with no strings attached. It was more kindness than she had known in years, and it terrified her. She ate the bread slowly, mechanically, her eyes scanning the small, Spartan room. It was a man's space, clean but unadorned. A rifle rested on pegs above the fireplace. A worn leather saddle was slung over a sawhorse in the corner. Everything had a purpose. There was an order to it, a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from the very logs in the walls. Hesitantly, she pushed open the cabin door and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool. The vast Arizona sky an endless, aching blue. Caleb's homestead was carved into the land, not built upon it. It was a place of struggle. The fields were strewn with rocks, the earth a stubborn, reddish-brown clay. A small herd of goats, wiry and resilient, watched her with intelligent yellow eyes from a makeshift pen, beyond the cabin and the small, sturdy barn. The world opened up into a panorama of jagged mesas and sun-scorched plains that stretched to the edge of the world. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape, a place that could swallow a person whole. Yet, as she stood there, with the gentle wind stirring the loose strands of her hair and the warmth of the rising sun on her face, a strange feeling settled over her. It was a feeling she had to search her memory to name. Safety. Here, with nothing but the sky and the stones as witnesses. She felt safe for the first time in years. She spent the day in a dreamlike state, exploring the small territory that was her refuge. She found the well and drew a bucket of cold, clear water. She milked the goats, her city-soft hands clumsy at first, but the rhythmic work was soothing. The animals were not afraid of her. They nudged her hands, their presence simple and undemanding. She was not a mail-order bride here. She was not a fugitive. She was just a woman, tending to a small, quiet piece of the world. As the sun reached its zenith, she sat in the shade of the cabin, her back against the rough-hewn logs, and the past came for her. It always did in moments of stillness. Chicago. The memory was a smear of gaslight, cigar smoke, and the constant, deafening noise of the city. She had worked at the Gilded Cage, a saloon that was more gilded than cagey. She poured whiskey for men with hard eyes and soft hands, her smile a painted-on mask. She was saving money, dreaming of a small dress shop, a life of quiet dignity far away from the grime and the grasping. Then came Arthur. He was handsome, with a quick smile and words as smooth as the bourbon he drank. He saw her. He said, not just the girl who poured the drinks, but the woman underneath. He promised her protection, a future, love. She, who had never known a gentle touch, believed him. For a few blissful months, she had allowed herself to hope. The betrayal was as swift as it was absolute. The saloon owner, a man named Finn, kept his earnings in a small safe. One night, the money vanished, and Arthur, her Arthur, was the one who pointed the finger at her. He told Finn he had seen her, that she had confessed her plan to him, that she was a common thief who had been playing him for a fool. It was his word against hers, and her word was worth nothing. He had a motive, a gambling debt he owed to Finn. Framing her settled his account. He did not just abandon her to Finn's wrath, he participated in it. She remembered the small, windowless room in the back of the saloon, Finn's meaty fists, his foul breath, and Arthur standing by the door, his handsome face a mask of cold indifference, watching as the man she loved allowed her to be brutalized for a crime she did not commit. He was her accuser, her judge, and the silent witness to her punishment. The police came later. She was arrested, dragged through the streets, her name and face printed in the scandal sheets. The trial was a formality. Arthur, the informant, was lauded for his civic duty. She was sentenced to 6 months in the Cook County Jail, a place of filth and despair. When she was released, it was under humiliating terms. She was to leave the state of Illinois and never return. She was a pariah, ruined and alone. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like a lifeline, a chance to become someone else, somewhere else, a woman with no family, no past. It was not a lie. The woman she had been in Chicago was dead. A shadow fell over her, pulling her from the drowning depths of the memory. She looked up, gasping, her heart pounding. It was Caleb, returned. He stood a few feet away, his horse behind him, its reins held loosely in his hand. His face was unreadable, carved from the same stone as the mountains around them. "You're still here," he said. It was not a question. She nodded, unable to speak, scrambling to her feet and brushing the dust from her dress. She felt a hot flush of shame, as if he could see the filth of her past clinging to her. "The sheriff won't be a problem," he said, his voice low. He dismounted, looping the reins over a fence post. "He seems to have forgotten your name." The relief that washed over her was so intense it made her dizzy, but it was followed by a cold dread. "And Mr. Briggs?" she whispered. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Briggs is another matter. He's telling anyone who will listen that I stole his property. He won't let this go." The fragile sense of safety she had felt all day shattered into 1,000 pieces. She was poison. She had brought her ruin to this man's door, this quiet, decent man who had shown her nothing but kindness. He had fought for her, paid for her, and for what? To be dragged into her disgrace. "I have to go," she said, the words rushing out. "I cannot stay here. I will not bring this trouble on you." She believed it with every fiber of her being. She was ruined, a tainted thing not fit for a good man's care. She turned, her mind racing, planning to just walk, to disappear into the vast wilderness. She had not taken 2 steps before he was in front of her, blocking her path. He moved with a speed that belied his size. She tried to sidestep him, but he was there again. Panic seized her. "Please," she begged, looking not at his face but at his chest. "Let me go." He caught her on horseback an hour later, a few miles from the homestead. She had been walking blindly, following the path of a dry wash, with no food, no water, and no idea where she was going. She only knew she had to leave. The sound of hoofbeats behind her made her heart leap into her throat, and she started to run, stumbling over the loose rocks. He easily overtook her, swinging down from his horse in a single fluid motion. He didn't yell, he didn't grab her. This time, he did not speak at all. He simply stood in her path, a solid, immovable presence. She stopped, her chest heaving, trapped. Tears of frustration and fear blurred her vision. Then, with a gentleness that undid her completely, he reached out, placed his hands on her waist, and lifted her down from the rocky ledge she had scrambled onto. He set her on her feet, and then, before she could pull away, he drew her against his chest and held her. It was not a lover's embrace, it was the hold of an anchor in a storm. One of his arms was firm around her back, the other hand resting gently on her head, tucking her face into the rough fabric of his shirt. She was rigid at first, every muscle tensed to fight or flee, but he just stood there, solid and warm, absorbing the tremors that racked her body. He smelled of leather, dust, and sweat, the scent of the very earth she stood upon. Slowly, agonizingly, the tension began to drain out of her. The frantic trembling subsided into quiet shudders. She did not wrap her arms around him, but she stopped resisting. She leaned into him, a silent admission of defeat, and let him hold her until she stopped shaking. That night, they sat by the fire in the cabin. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with a heavy, unspoken understanding. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lillian stared into the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm tin cup of coffee. She didn't know why she started talking. Perhaps it was the quiet safety of the room, or the way he had held her without demanding anything in return. The words began as a trickle, then a flood. She told him about Chicago, about the gilded cage, about the dreams she had saved for. She told him about Arthur, about the theft, about the lies. Her voice was a low, toneless monotone, as if she were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. But when she spoke of what had happened in the back room, of the betrayal and the humiliation, her voice broke. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. She stopped, pressing her lips together, fighting for control. "After that," she whispered, her voice cracking with a pain so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. "After him, after the jail, I decided I never wanted to be touched again." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. She finally looked at Caleb. His face was cast in shadow, but she could see the grim set of his jaw, the muscle that worked in his cheek. He looked shaken, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair, but his eyes, when they met hers, held not pity, but a profound, aching sorrow. He got up and came to kneel in front of her. She flinched, expecting him to pull away, to recoil from her sordid tale. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, raised his hands and cupped her face. His touch was feather-light, his calloused palms a warm, gentle weight against her skin. It was a touch that asked for nothing. It only gave. He looked directly into her eyes, and the world seemed to shrink to the small space between them. "Then I won't touch you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Unless you ask." His promise was a vow, a sacred oath sworn in the flickering firelight. It was the most precious gift he could have given her. It was the one thing no one ever had, a choice. In the days that followed, a delicate, unspoken truce settled between them. A new closeness began to grow, tender and aching, restrained by the invisible walls of her trauma and his promise. They lived and worked in a shared orbit of quiet companionship. He would rise before dawn to work the ranch, and she would have coffee waiting when he came in. She tended the small vegetable garden, cooked their simple meals, and mended his clothes. They spoke little, but they were always aware of each other. Sometimes, their hands would brush as he passed her a tool, and a jolt would pass between them, a reminder of the line he would not cross. But their fragile sanctuary was an island in a hostile sea. The town was watching when Caleb had to ride in for supplies. Lillian insisted on going with him. She would not hide like a criminal. But the moment they rode down the main street, she felt it. The conversations that stopped, the curtains that twitched in the windows, the cold, assessing stares. Thomas Briggs had been busy, poisoning the well of public opinion, painting her as a woman of low morals who had bewitched a simple rancher. At the general store, women turned their backs on her. The pastor's wife, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, looked right through her. Lillian kept her chin high, her hands steady as she gathered their meager provisions. But inside, she was shrinking. Each hostile glance was a fresh cut, tearing open old wounds. They rode home in silence, the weight of the town's judgment heavy in the air between them. As they approached the homestead, Caleb spurred his horse forward, a sudden urgency in his movements. Lillian saw it a moment later. Scrawled across the weathered wood of his barn door, in thick, crude letters of white paint, was a single, ugly word. Whore. It was a brand, a public condemnation. The town had passed its sentence. The word seemed to scream at her from across the yard, a violation of the one place in the world she had felt safe. The sanctuary had been breached. The past she had run from had found her, and it had a name. Caleb spent the next morning painting over the word on the barn door. Each stroke of the brush was a deliberate, angry act, an attempt to erase the ugliness that had invaded their lives. Lillian watched him from the cabin doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The new paint, a stark, clean white, covered the slur. but it could not erase the violation. It was a scar now, a visible reminder of the town's contempt. The word was gone, but the sentiment remained, hanging in the air like the heat that shimmered off the baked earth. A few days later, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a plume of dust that marked his slow, inexorable approach. It was Sheriff Miller. He rode not with the easy gait of a friend, but with the stiff-backed formality of a man on official business. Caleb saw him coming and stopped his work, leaning on the handle of his axe, his face a hard, unreadable mask. Lillian, who had been feeding the chickens, retreated to the relative safety of the cabin, but she left the door ajar, her ear pressed to the narrow opening. "Caleb," the sheriff said, reining in his horse but not dismounting. It was a subtle assertion of authority, a reminder of their respective positions. "Sheriff," Caleb replied, his voice flat. "Been some talk in town," Miller began, avoiding Caleb's direct gaze and looking instead at the freshly painted barn door. "A lot of talk. Thomas Briggs has been stirring the pot. He's got friends on the town council. Important friends." "Briggs is a snake," Caleb said, "and the council is full of old women who listen to gossip." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Maybe so, but they're the ones who make the rules. They're talking about public decency, moral hygiene. They're saying the woman, Lillian, is an unwelcome influence. They want to press for her removal. They're looking for a legal reason. Caleb, any reason." The threat was veiled, but the meaning was crystal clear. The money Caleb had paid the sheriff had bought silence, but it had not bought acceptance. It had erased a warrant, but it could not erase the whispers, the judgment. The law had many arms, and if one was tied, another could still be used to strike. "She has done nothing wrong," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "It doesn't matter what she's done," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "It matters what people think she's done. I'm telling you this as a courtesy. You bought my cooperation, not my protection. You're on your own with this. Get her out of here, Caleb, or the council will find a way to do it for you, and it will be a lot uglier." He turned his horse and rode away without another word, leaving his warning to fester in the still, hot air. Inside the cabin, Lillian felt the floor drop out from under her. She had heard every word. She was a disease, a contamination that was spreading, threatening to consume the one person who had shown her compassion. The shame was a physical thing, a burning heat that spread from her chest through her entire body. When Caleb came inside, his face like a thundercloud, she was ready for him. "I heard," she said, her voice small but steady. "I heard it all." He slammed his hat down on the table, the sound echoing in the small room. He didn't look at her. "You have to let me go," she said, stepping toward him. "Now, before they do what he said. You have done enough. More than enough. You don't owe me this." Her voice broke on the last word. "You don't owe me anything." He turned to face her then, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. "Owe you," he repeated, his voice raw. "This isn't about owing anyone anything." "Then what is it about?" she cried, her composure finally crumbling. "Why are you doing this? Why are you risking everything for me? A stranger, a woman with a past you know nothing about, a woman the whole town believes is a—" She couldn't say the word. "Because I know what happens when you don't," he said, the fire in his eyes banking into a deep, hollow ache. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a weariness so profound it seemed to age him before her eyes. He sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. "I lost someone once," he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him. "Someone I was supposed to protect. Her name was Eliza." Lillian stood frozen, listening to the confession he pulled from the deepest, most guarded part of himself. "She was my fiancée," he continued, his gaze fixed on some distant point in his own memory. "Her father was a man a lot like Briggs, mean, controlling. He saw her as his property. She was terrified of him. The night before our wedding, she came to me. She begged me to take her away, to just ride, to not look back. She said he would never let her be happy. He paused, swallowing hard. And I told her no. I told her to be strong. I said we would face him together, as man and wife, under the protection of the law. I told her we had to do things the right way. He let out a short, bitter laugh. The right way. The next morning, she was gone. Her father had locked her in her room. He sent word that she was ill. I tried to see her, but he wouldn't let me. A week later, he sent for the doctor. It was too late. She died in childbirth. The baby, too. His voice was a hoarse whisper. She had tried to escape on her own, and had fallen. She was trying to get to me, and I wasn't there. I chose the law over the person I loved. I didn't save her. He finally looked at Lillian, his eyes filled with a grief so vast it seemed to suck all the air from the room. So don't tell me I don't owe you anything. I owe it to her. I won't make that mistake again. The story settled over Lillian, a heavy, sorrowful blanket. His actions were not about her, not really. They were about him, about a ghost named Eliza. He was trying to save the woman he saw in front of him, to atone for the one he had lost. A wave of compassion washed over her, so strong it almost brought her to her knees. She understood him now. She understood his quiet strength, his stubborn refusal to back down. It was born of regret. She said nothing. There were no words that could touch a wound that deep. But in that moment, something shifted between them. The chasm of their separate pasts had been bridged by a shared understanding of pain. That night, she gathered her few belongings and the blanket from her cot. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked, watching her from the doorway. "I'll sleep in the barn," she said quietly. "It's better this way. With the town watching, it's not right. Me being in here." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. The truth was, his confession had made him more real, more vulnerable, and in a strange way, more dangerous to her fragile peace. She needed space. She needed to not be Eliza's ghost. Caleb looked as though he wanted to argue, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. He gave a single, weary nod. He did not argue. Later that night, the sky broke open. The storm rolled in from the mountains without warning. A furious onslaught of wind, rain, and lightning. The thunder was a physical blow, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. Lillian, huddled in a nest of hay in the barn, jumped at every crack of thunder, every flash of lightning that illuminated the gaps in the wooden walls. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the rain hammered against the roof, a relentless, deafening assault. She was not afraid of the storm. She was afraid of the memories it stirred, the noise, the violence, the feeling of being trapped and powerless. It all brought her back to that small, dark room in Chicago. She could almost feel Finn's hands on her, smell the whiskey on his breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white as she clutched the rough blanket. But the past was a storm inside her, and it was just as powerful as the one raging outside. She could not bear it. She could not be alone. Without thinking, she scrambled out of the hay and ran from the barn, out into the maelstrom. The rain hit her like a physical blow, plastering her thin nightdress to her skin in an instant, blinding her. The ground was a churning sea of mud. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and pushed herself back up, her only thought to get to the small, steady light of the cabin window. She burst through the door, drenched, shivering, her hair plastered to her face. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for the rifle he kept by the fireplace before he saw it was her. "Lillian!" She stood there, dripping on the floor, her body shaking from a cold that had nothing to do with the rain. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, the words chattering out between her teeth. "Just of myself." He didn't ask any questions. He grabbed the driest blanket he could find and wrapped it around her, pulling her closer to the warmth of the fire. He sat her down in his chair and knelt before her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else, something deeper. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the roar of the storm outside and the crackle of the fire within. The shaking slowly subsided, but she was still trembling. A fine, deep tremor that came from the soul. Then, hesitantly, her hand still shaking, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles tensed under her touch. "Stay near me," she whispered. It was a plea. He nodded, his throat working. He did not move away. Her nightdress was soaked, and her skin was like ice. He could see the feverish glint in her eyes. Without a word, he rose and went to a small chest, taking out a jar of ointment and a clean, dry cloth. He came back and knelt before her again. "Your dress is soaked," he said, his voice husky. "You'll catch your death." This was the moment, the precipice. He was going to remove her wet clothes. It was a practical necessity, but it was also the most intimate act imaginable. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of his promise, "Unless you ask." She did not ask, but she did not pull away. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he undid the simple buttons at her throat. He was slow, deliberate, his gaze fixed on his task, not on her. He peeled the wet, cold fabric from her shoulders, his knuckles brushing against her skin. She flinched, but it was a reflex. Not a rejection. He pulled the dress down her arms and let it fall to the floor in a sodden heap. She sat before him in nothing but her thin chemise, which was nearly as wet. He did not look at her body. He looked at her skin, at the goosebumps that rose on her arms, at the faint, feverish flush on her cheeks. He dipped his fingers in the ointment and began to gently rub it onto her arms. The ointment was cool, and his touch was warm. It was not a lover's caress. It was the touch of a healer. It was methodical, respectful, and utterly safe. He treated her skin not as an object of desire, but as something that needed tending, that needed care. She watched his hands. His head bent in concentration. A tear slipped from her eye and rolled down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. "I never knew," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never knew I could feel safe like this." He stopped, his hand still on her arm. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. The air in the room grew thick, charged with all the unspoken things between them. The storm outside seemed to fade into a distant roar. "I want you, Lillian," he admitted, his voice a low, rough whisper. The confession was a raw, honest thing. "I have from the first moment I saw you, but I meant what I said. I will not cross that line." He paused, his gaze intense. "Not unless you beg me to." The desire was there, naked and undeniable in his eyes, and a mirror of it was stirring within her, a feeling she had thought long dead. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. He was offering her not just his body, but the power over it. Slowly, he leaned in. She leaned in, too, drawn by an invisible force. Their lips were only an inch apart. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. It would be so easy to close the distance, to answer the silent question in his eyes. But she couldn't. Not yet. The ghosts were still there, whispering in the corners of the room. The memory of other hands, other lips, of pain and betrayal, was a wall of ice around her heart. She pulled back, shaking her head slightly, a silent, regretful apology in her eyes. "Not yet," she whispered. The fragile peace that had settled over Caleb's homestead could not last. It was a shelter built of kind words and quiet gestures. But the storm of the outside world was gathering strength, and its name was Thomas Briggs. Briggs had been patient, letting the town's gossip do his work for him. But his patience had worn thin. He wanted what he had paid for, and he wanted the town to see him take it. The confrontation happened at Miller's general store. the hub of Dry Hollow's social and commercial life. Caleb needed grain for his livestock, and Lillian, refusing to be a prisoner on the ranch, had insisted on accompanying him. She walked into the store with her head held high, her back straight, a silent defiance in the set of her shoulders. But the air grew thick with unspoken judgment the moment she crossed the threshold. The hum of conversation died. Mrs. Miller, behind the counter, offered a tight, disapproving smile. Two other women who had been inspecting a bolt of calico turned away, whispering behind their hands. Lillian ignored them, her focus on the list of supplies in her hand. She was standing by a barrel of dried beans, counting out scoops into a cloth sack, when a large shadow fell over her. "Well, well," a familiar, gravelly voice said. "Look what the cat dragged in." She froze, her hand hovering over the barrel. She didn't have to look up to know it was Thomas Briggs. He stood too close, his bulk radiating a menacing heat. She could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "Come to town to show off your new keeper," he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. Lillian said nothing, keeping her eyes fixed on the beans. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. "I'm talking to you, girl," he growled, his voice dropping. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You owe me. You belong to me. I have the papers to prove it." Something inside Lillian snapped. It was the touch, the assumption of ownership, the public humiliation. All the fear and shame that had held her captive for so long coalesced into a single, sharp point of white-hot fury. She looked up at him, her stormy eyes blazing. "Take your hands off me," she said, her voice low and trembling with rage. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Or what? You'll run crying to him?" He gestured with his head toward Caleb, who was at the far end of the counter, his back to them. With a speed that surprised them both, Lillian raised her free hand and slapped Thomas Briggs across the face. The sound was like a pistol shot in the silent store. Briggs's head snapped to the side, a red handprint blooming on his cheek. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then, his face contorted into a mask of pure venom. He drew his head back and spat, a thick glob of saliva landing on her cheek. Lillian recoiled, a gasp of pure horror escaping her lips. The physical blow would have been less of a violation. This was a defilement, an act of utter contempt meant to strip her of the last vestiges of her dignity. Before Briggs could do anything else, Caleb was there. He moved with a quiet, deadly speed, his face a granite mask of cold fury. He didn't say a word. He simply drew the Colt revolver from the holster at his hip. The click of the hammer being pulled back was unnaturally loud in the still room. He pressed the cold, steel barrel against Briggs's temple. "Wipe it off," Caleb said, his voice a lethal whisper. Briggs froze, his eyes wide, the bravado draining from his face. He could feel the unyielding pressure of the gun against his skin. "I said," Caleb repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "Wipe it off, now." Slowly, his hands shaking, Briggs reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. With a trembling hand, he reached toward Lillian's face. She flinched away, but Caleb's eyes never left Briggs. He gently, clumsily, wiped the spittle from her cheek. "Now get out," Caleb said, his voice like ice. "And if you ever lay a hand on her or speak to her again, I will kill you where you stand. That is not a threat. It is a promise." He pulled the gun back. Briggs, pale and shaken, scrambled backward, knocking over a stack of tinned peaches before turning and fleeing the store. The silence he left behind was thick and heavy. Everyone stared. Not at the door Briggs had disappeared through, but at Caleb and Lillian. He had defended her. Yes, but he had done it by drawing a gun in a public place. He had crossed a line. The whispers started immediately. Talk of a trial, of scandal, of moral outrage. Caleb had not solved a problem. He had ignited a fire. The following Sunday, The summons came, not from the sheriff, but from a higher authority in the court of public opinion. A young boy from the town delivered a sealed note for Lillian. It was from Martha Gable, the pastor's wife. It was not a request, it was a command. Be at the church parsonage at 2 o'clock. You don't have to go, Caleb said, seeing the fear in Lillian's eyes. Yes, I do, she replied. Running from them only makes them feel more righteous. The parsonage was a neat, white-painted house that smelled of beeswax and piety. Martha Gable was a thin, severe woman whose charity did not extend to those she deemed fallen. She sat in a stiff-backed chair in her parlor, the Bible open on her lap, though she never once looked at it. I have asked you here, Lillian, she began, her voice devoid of warmth, because I am concerned for the soul of this community. A town is like a family, and when a corrupting influence enters that family, it must be addressed. Lillian sat opposite her, her hands folded in her lap, her face a pale, still mask. Mr. Briggs is a respected member of this town. Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes like chips of flint. He is a landowner, a provider. You came here under a contract to be his wife, a respectable position. Instead, you have forsaken your duty and taken up residence with another man, a man who is not your husband. You have tempted him, leading him to draw a weapon in public and threaten another man's life. That is not what happened, Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. It is what everyone saw, the pastor's wife snapped. They saw a man driven to violence by a woman of loose morals. You are a disruption, a source of scandal. You are ruining an honest Christian family before it has even begun, and you are pulling a good man down with you. Every word was a stone, thrown with righteous aim. Lillian felt the weight of them, the bruises they left on her spirit. She was not a person to this woman. She was a symbol of sin, a blight to be cleansed. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but no words would come. What could she say? The truth of her past was far uglier than the fiction they had invented for her. She fled the parsonage without another word, her cheeks burning with a shame so profound it was suffocating. She ran, not back to the homestead, but toward the river, the only place that offered solitude. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until she reached the muddy banks, where the cottonwoods wept their leaves into the slow-moving water. There, she collapsed, her body racked with sobs, the accusations of the pastor's wife echoing in her head. A corrupting influence, a woman of loose morals. She didn't know how long she knelt there, crying, the mud seeping into the fabric of her dress. She was only aware of a presence beside her when a pair of worn leather boots entered her field of vision. It was Caleb. He had followed her. He didn't speak. He knelt beside her in the mud and took her hands in his. They were caked with dirt, her nails broken. He dipped his handkerchief into the cool river water and began to gently, patiently, wash the mud from her hands, from each finger, from the lines of her palms. The simple, tender act was her undoing. It was an absolution she had not asked for and did not feel she deserved. When her hands were clean, he held them in his own. She looked at him through her tears, her face a mess of sorrow and despair. "Do you ever wish you hadn't found me?" she asked, the question torn from the deepest, most insecure part of her soul. He looked at her, his expression soft, the hardness she had seen in the store completely gone. He leaned forward and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her forehead. It was a benediction. "Every piece of your past is yours, Lillian," he said, his voice low and steady. "Every mistake, every hurt, every scar, it all belongs to you. And I don't need it. I don't need to know it or fix it or erase it to love what I see right now." His words were the purest truth she had ever heard. He was not trying to save Eliza's ghost. He was saving her. He loved what he saw. Not the runaway, not the fallen woman, not the mail-order bride, but her, Lillian. The acceptance in his words, in his touch, was a balm on her wounded spirit. The wall of ice around her heart began to melt. That night, The air in the cabin was different. The space between them was no longer charged with restraint and unspoken longing, but with a quiet, simmering certainty. Caleb sat by the fire, mending a piece of tack, his hands sure and steady. Lillian sat on her cot, brushing her hair. The simple, repetitive motion, a calming rhythm. But she was not calm. A decision had been made, deep within her. She rose from the cot and walked toward him. She was barefoot, wearing only her thin white nightdress. Her long, dark hair fell loose over her shoulders. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer ashamed. She stopped in front of his chair, and he looked up, his hands stilling their work. The firelight danced in her eyes, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a fierce, vulnerable resolve. "I want to be yours," she said, her voice a soft, clear whisper. It was not a plea. It was a statement, a gift. "If you'll have me, like this, broken pieces and all." She was asking. He rose slowly from his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He leaned in and kissed her, and this time, it was not a kiss of promise or of comfort. It was a kiss of deep, unrestrained passion, a confirmation of everything that had passed between them. She answered it with a hunger of her own, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to his own bed, a wide mattress in the corner of the room that she had never approached. He laid her down gently, and for a moment, he just looked at her, his gaze full of a raw, tender adoration that made her breath catch in her throat. Their lovemaking was a discovery. For him, it was the discovery of her resilience, her hidden strength. For her, it was the discovery of tenderness. His every touch was a question, his every caress a reassurance. He moved with a slow, deliberate intensity, teaching her a new language, one in which passion and safety could exist in the same breath. He erased the memories of other hands, other bodies, replacing them with a new reality, one of love without demand, of desire without pain. In the middle of it, she was overwhelmed. A sob broke from her lips, then another. It was not a cry of pain, but of release. All the grief, all the fear, all the shame she had carried for so long came pouring out of her. Caleb did not stop. He did not pull away. He gathered her closer, holding her tightly, whispering her name like a prayer, his movements slowing to a gentle, rocking rhythm. He held her until the storm inside her passed, until her sobs quieted into soft shudders, until she could breathe again. He held her through the breaking, and he was still there to hold the pieces as they began to come back together, whole and new. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, the fire burning low, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Lillian lay with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "I've never known that," she confessed into the quiet darkness. "Love without pain. I didn't think it was real." He tightened his arm around her, kissing the top of her head. "You will now," he said, his voice a solemn vow in the stillness of the night. "I promise." But even as he spoke the words, the world outside was moving against them. The next afternoon, as they worked together in the yard, a silent, comfortable rhythm between them. Sheriff Miller rode up once more. This time, he dismounted, his face grim, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "Caleb," he said, twisting the brim of his hat. "My hands are tied." "What is it?" Caleb asked, stepping in front of Lillian protectively. The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. "Briggs isn't a fool. He knows a direct assault charge against you won't stick, not after he accosted Lillian, so he's using a different weapon." He held out the paper. "He's filed a legal petition with the circuit judge. He's petitioning to have Lillian arrested and deported from the territory under the Vagrancy Act of '78. Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. Vagrancy. The same charge they had used in Chicago. It was a catch-all law, designed to sweep away anyone deemed undesirable. "He can't do that," Caleb snarled. "She lives here. She works here." "The petition claims she has no visible means of support," the sheriff said, refusing to meet Caleb's eyes. "It claims she is a woman of ill repute, a known associate of criminals from her time in Illinois, and a moral threat to the community. Caleb, with the council backing him, the judge will grant it. It's a legal way of getting rid of her." The bribe, the fight, the promises, none of it mattered in the face of a piece of paper. "I'm sorry," the sheriff said. And for the first time, he sounded it. He was a man caught between a bad conscience and a worse reality. "The judge will be in Dry Hollow in 3 days' time to sign the order. You have until then." "Until then, to do what?" Caleb demanded. The sheriff finally looked at him, his face etched with grim finality. "To get her out of town. Get her out of the territory, or I'll have no choice but to execute the warrant and arrest her." The sheriff's departure left a void in the air, a vacuum of silence where the future had once been. 3 days, 72 hours. It was not a reprieve. It was a death sentence with a slight delay. Caleb and Lillian stood in the yard, the harsh afternoon sun beating down on them, the world seeming to hold its breath. Caleb was the first to move. There was no hesitation in him, no moment of doubt. He turned not to Lillian, but toward the corral where his small herd of cattle stood, the culmination of years of back-breaking labor. His expression was not one of defeat, but of cold, hard resolve. "It's settled then," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "We ride for New Mexico." Lillian's heart constricted. "Caleb, your home, your ranch." He finally looked at her, and the hardness in his eyes softened. "It's just land, Lillian. It's rock and dirt. I built it once. I can build it again." He reached out and touched her cheek, a gesture that was both a comfort and a promise. "But you are not rock and dirt. We leave." The next 2 days were a blur of frantic, purposeful activity. There was no time for sorrow or for second-guessing. Caleb rode out that same afternoon, driving half his herd, the best half, toward the larger Cross Creek Ranch, 20 miles south. He returned late that night, bone-weary but with a heavy pouch of gold coins that he silently placed on the table. It was the price of his past, and the down payment on their future. The next day, he made a furtive trip into a neighboring town, not Dry Hollow, to a dusty print shop run by a man named Silas, a man who owed him a favor and who knew how to ask no questions. He came back with 2 sets of travel documents, the ink still smelling fresh. They gave Caleb a new last name, Blackwood, and identified Lillian as his wife, Mrs. Lillian Blackwood. She stared at the name, a strange flutter in her chest. It was a lie, but it felt more real than any truth she had ever known. While Caleb was securing their escape, Lillian was settling her own accounts. She sat at the small wooden table in the cabin, a pot of ink and a straight pen before her. She was not running from her past this time. She was facing it, and she was making sure it was known. She wrote 2 letters, her hand moving with a steady, determined grace. The first was to Martha Gable, the pastor's wife. It was not an apology, it was a testimony. With stark, unsparing honesty, she detailed her life in Chicago. She wrote of Arthur's betrayal, of the saloon owner's brutality, of a legal system that had protected the guilty and condemned the innocent. She did not write with self-pity, but with a cold, clear-eyed fury. "You spoke to me of moral hygiene," she wrote, "but you were not interested in the truth of my soul, only in the tidiness of your town. You judged a book not by its cover, but by a single, torn page you had not even read. I do not ask for your forgiveness, for I have done nothing to you that requires it. I ask only that you consider that the sin you see in others may be a reflection of the judgment in your own heart." The second letter was to Sheriff Miller. This one was different. It was shorter, and the anger was tempered with a sliver of weary understanding. "You hold an office of the law," she wrote. "But you and I both know the law is not always just. I am leaving this territory because your law has failed me, just as it failed me in Illinois. It has chosen the word of a powerful, cruel man over the life of a woman he sought to harm. Caleb Ward paid you to forget my past. I am writing to you now so that you will remember it. Remember that you hold the power to protect, not just to punish, I hope, for the sake of the next woman who finds herself alone and in trouble in your town, that you choose to use it more wisely." She sealed both letters with a drop of wax, her own small act of closing a chapter. She would leave them on the table when they left. Let the town read them. Let them whisper. She would be gone. Their last night at the ranch was achingly quiet. They packed what little they could into 2 saddlebags: clothes, the forged documents, the remaining gold, a canteen, and a parcel of dried meat and bread. The cabin, stripped of their few personal belongings, already felt empty. A hollow shell that had briefly been a home. The air was heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of the life they were leaving behind and the terrifying uncertainty of the one that lay ahead. They did not speak of their fears. Instead, they moved around each other with a quiet, solemn tenderness. He cleaned his rifle, his hands methodical and sure. She mended a tear in his shirt, her stitches small and neat. Every simple act was imbued with a profound significance, a final, loving gesture. That night, they lay in his bed, their bodies pressed close, seeking warmth and reassurance in the darkness. He held her, his arm a solid, protective weight across her waist. She rested her head in the hollow of his shoulder, her hand spread flat over his heart, feeling its slow, steady rhythm. There was no passion between them, only a deep, desperate intimacy. Their hearts were heavy, but beneath the fear, there was a fragile seedling of hope. They had each other. It was the only thing they could be sure of. "Are you scared?" she whispered into the darkness. He was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he finally admitted, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "But not as scared as I was of losing you." She tightened her hand over his heart, and they held each other through the long, dark night, 2 solitary souls clinging together on the edge of a precipice. They rode out at dawn. The sky to the east was a pale, pearlescent gray, streaked with the first faint blushes of pink. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. A profound silence lay over the land, the sacred hush of a world waking up. They did not look back at the small cabin, at the newly painted barn, at the life they had built and were now abandoning. They set their faces east, toward the rising sun, toward New Mexico. For the first few hours, a sense of hopeful peace settled over them. They were free. Every mile they covered was a victory, a step away from the judgment of Dry Hollow and the reach of Thomas Briggs's law. They rode through a wide, open plain, the land unfolding before them in a vast, empty expanse. But as the sun climbed higher, the terrain began to change. The plains gave way to a series of rolling hills and then to a landscape of stark, red rock canyons, their walls carved by wind and time into jagged, imposing shapes. The trail led them down into the belly of one such canyon, a narrow, winding passage with walls that rose 100 feet on either side. The air grew still and close, the silence suddenly oppressive. The rhythmic clip-clop of their horses' hooves was the only sound, echoing off the rock walls. Caleb reined in his horse, his body suddenly tense. He scanned the rim of the canyon above them, his eyes narrowed, his hand drifting instinctively toward the butt of his rifle. "What is it?" Lillian whispered, pulling her horse up beside his. "It's too quiet," he said, his voice low. "No birds, nothing." And then he saw it, a flicker of movement on the canyon rim to their right, a glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel. "Lillian, ride!" he yelled, but it was too late. The first shot cracked through the silence. the sound impossibly loud as it ricocheted off the canyon walls. A puff of dust exploded from the rock just inches from Lillian's head. Before she could react, 3 figures appeared on the rim above them, silhouetted against the bright morning sky. A 4th man stepped out from behind a massive boulder on the trail ahead, blocking their path. It was Thomas Briggs. A cruel, triumphant smile twisted his lips. It was an ambush, a trap. "Nowhere left to run," Briggs called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. He held a pistol, and it was aimed squarely at Caleb. Caleb didn't hesitate. He shoved Lillian's horse hard, sending it stumbling forward. "Go!" he roared, drawing his own revolver. He fired a shot toward Briggs, forcing the man to duck for cover, and then twisted in his saddle, firing up at the men on the rim. Another shot rang out, this one from above. Lillian heard a grunt of pain beside her. She turned, her heart seizing in her chest. Caleb slumped forward in his saddle, a dark, wet stain spreading rapidly across his shoulder and chest. His gun clattered from his hand, falling into the dust. "Caleb!" she screamed, a sound of pure primal terror. He looked at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He tried to speak, but only a choked gasp came out. He swayed in the saddle, and then fell, crashing heavily to the ground. Everything seemed to slow down. The world became a maelstrom of dust, shouting, and the deafening roar of gunfire. Lillian saw Briggs advancing, his pistol raised. She saw the men on the rim starting to scramble down the rocks. She saw Caleb, lying so terribly still in the dust, his blood staining the red earth an even deeper shade of crimson. A fire she never knew she possessed erupted inside her. It was not thought. It was not reason. It was a raw, desperate instinct to protect, to survive, to fight back. She threw herself from her horse, scrambling through the dirt to where Caleb lay. Her hands found his fallen revolver. It was heavy, alien in her grasp. She had never fired a gun in her life. She rose to her knees, the heavy weapon held in both shaking hands, and pointed it in the direction of the attackers. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hands, the recoil jarring her to the bone, the explosion deafening. She didn't aim. She just fired, again and again, wildly. A desperate, terrified creature lashing out at the predators who had brought down her mate. One of her wild shots found its mark. One of the men scrambling down the canyon wall cried out, clutching his leg, and tumbled the rest of the way down, landing in a heap. The sheer, unexpected ferocity of her counterattack gave the others pause. It was in that moment of hesitation that a new sound entered the fray, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, and a single, authoritative shout. "Drop your weapons! This is the sheriff!" Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies appeared at the mouth of the canyon, their rifles raised. They had been following from a distance, a small act of conscience that had just saved 2 lives. Briggs and his 2 remaining men, caught between the law and the wild-eyed woman with the gun, threw down their weapons in disgust. The sheriff dismounted, his face a grim mask of anger and regret. He looked at the wounded man, at the blood-soaked ground, and then at Caleb, who was stirring, groaning in pain. Lillian was at his side in an instant, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound. "He's alive," she choked out, her voice thick with tears and gunpowder. As the deputies rounded up the ambushers, Briggs was hauled to his feet, even in defeat. His face was a mask of sneering hatred. He looked past the sheriff, his eyes locking on the small crowd of townsfolk who had followed the law out of curiosity and were now gathered at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. "You think he's some kind of hero?" Briggs bellowed, his voice raw with spite. "You think he did all this for love? He's a liar. He paid to erase her past, paid the sheriff to bury her arrest warrant from Illinois. Everyone knows it now." The secret was out, thrown like a grenade into the shocked silence. The townsfolk murmured, their eyes shifting from Briggs to Caleb, to the sheriff, and finally, to Lillian. The bribe. It was all true. Caleb, bleeding but conscious, pushed himself up on one elbow. He ignored the pain, ignored Briggs, ignored the staring crowd. He looked only at Lillian, his eyes full of a fierce, unwavering love. "Let it come," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I'll take every sin you've ever carried. Lillian, I'll take every judgment, every whisper. I'll take it all, if it means you stay free." The last of her walls crumbled, the last of her shame washed away in the face of his sacrifice. She leaned down, in front of the sheriff, in front of the entire town, and kissed him, a deep, desperate kiss that tasted of dust, blood, and salvation. His sin was her sin now. His life was hers. "Then you'll have all of me," she whispered against his lips. The sheriff watched them, his face a complicated landscape of duty and something that looked almost like admiration. He had seen the truth of the ambush. He had seen the woman's fierce defense. He made a decision. He turned to his deputies. "Get these men locked up. Briggs is charged with attempted murder." Then he walked over to where Lillian was still kneeling by Caleb's side. He looked down at them, not as a lawman, but as a man. "The doctor is in the next town over. In Silver Creek," he said quietly, his voice for her and Caleb alone. "It's a day's ride from here. You can make it. You've got 2 days before this whole sorry business becomes official." He was giving them a head start. It was all he could do. As Lillian and one of the deputies helped Caleb onto a horse, the whispers started among the townsfolk. But they were different now. They were not whispers of condemnation, but of something else entirely, of awe. They had seen a man willing to die for a woman's freedom. They had seen a woman rise up like a Shelleyan to defend him. Not everyone hated her anymore. Some, perhaps for the first time, were beginning to understand. The journey to Silver Creek was a haze of pain and fear. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever, while Lillian rode beside him, her face a pale mask of determination. She kept pressure on the wound, talked to him in low, soothing tones when he groaned, and never once allowed the terror that clawed at her own heart to show in her eyes. They lived on the 2 days the sheriff had given them as if they were a lifetime, pushing themselves and their horses to the brink of exhaustion. The doctor in Silver Creek was a grim, practical man who smelled of whiskey and carbolic acid. He dug the bullet out of Caleb's shoulder on a kitchen table, with Lillian holding Caleb's hand and whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The recovery was slow, agonizing. They holed up in a small, rented adobe house on the edge of the New Mexico desert, a place so remote and forgotten it felt like the edge of the world. They were the Blackwoods now, a quiet couple who kept to themselves. In this new, quiet life, their roles reversed. Lillian became the caretaker, the provider, while Caleb fought off infection and the slow, deep ache in his bones. She learned to run their small, harsh homestead. She tended the chickens, haggled for supplies in the dusty Mexican village miles to the south, and learned to use a rifle, practicing on tin cans until she could hold the weapon without trembling. She grew leaner, her skin tanned by the relentless sun, and a new, quiet strength settled in her eyes. She was no longer a fragile thing to be protected. She was a survivor. But the peace they found was a fragile one, built over a chasm of memory. The past still lingered, a phantom guest in their small home. Lillian would wake in the dead of night, a silent scream caught in her throat, the ghosts of Chicago and the canyon ambush replaying themselves in her dreams. She would reach for Caleb, her hands shaking, needing the solid, warm reality of him to anchor her to the present. Caleb's wound never fully healed. It left him with a deep, puckered scar and a persistent stiffness in his shoulder. On cold mornings, or when he worked too hard, a sharp, grinding pain would remind him of the price they had paid for their escape. It was a constant, physical reminder of their shared trauma, a barometer of the storms they had weathered. They loved each other with a fierce, quiet intensity, a love forged in violence and sacrifice. But the shadows were always there, just beyond the circle of their lamplight. They lived this way for nearly a year, a long, monotonous season of healing. Then, a letter arrived. It was carried by a circuit-riding preacher, a thin, dusty man who passed through their valley twice a year. The letter was worn and travel-stained, addressed to Caleb Ward, care of the Silver Creek Post Office. It had taken months to find him. The handwriting was a familiar, boyish scrawl. It was from Jed, the young man who worked at the general store in Dry Hollow. Caleb opened it with hands that were not quite steady. Lillian stood beside him, her hand on his good shoulder, reading the words over his arm. "Mr. Ward," the letter began. "I hope this finds you in good health. A lot has changed here since you left. Thomas Briggs died in his cell in the territorial prison a few months back. The fever took him. No one much mourned him. Sheriff Miller turned in his badge about a month after that. Said he was too old for the job and moved to be with his daughter's family in California. We have a new sheriff now, a young man from Prescott who doesn't know you from Adam." Lillian's breath caught in her throat. The two men who had held their fate in their hands were gone. The letter continued. "The talk about you and Mrs. Blackwood, well, it died down. After folks heard what Briggs did in that canyon, and after the story of her letters to the pastor's wife and the sheriff got out, things changed. People don't see it the same way anymore. Your ranch is still there. I've been keeping an eye on it, running a few of my own cattle on the land to keep the squatters away. It's waiting for you." The final lines were the ones that struck them like a physical blow. "You could come home, if you want." If they want, the words hung in the still, dry air of the adobe house. They had a choice. For the first time, they had a choice that was not dictated by fear or flight. Lillian was the one who hesitated. The thought of returning to Dry Hollow, to the stares and the whispers, to the place of her deepest humiliation, was terrifying. Here, in this anonymous quiet, she was safe. "We have a life here, Caleb," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not much, but it's peaceful." Caleb looked around the small, bare room, at the life they had cobbled together from the wreckage of their past. Then he looked at her, at the strength in her face, a strength she had earned with her own two hands. "We built something here," he agreed, his voice gentle. He took her hands in his. "But we built it in the shadows, under a false name. It's a life spent hiding. Maybe it's time we built something out in the open." He was not talking about a ranch. He was talking about a life, a real one where they did not have to be afraid of a knock on the door or a letter from the past. He was offering her not just a home, but her name, her story, her dignity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but looking into his eyes, she found a courage she did not know she possessed. It was the courage he had given her. They returned to Dry Hollow months later, in the full light of a late autumn afternoon. The town looked the same, dusty, sun-bleached, and tired. But as they rode down the main street, something was different. The gossip was gone, replaced by a quiet, uncertain curiosity. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. They saw Mrs. Miller step out of the general store, her face unreadable, and give a short, almost imperceptible nod. They saw men on the boardwalk touch the brims of their hats, a gesture of grudging respect. The memories remained, thick as the dust in the air, but the open hostility had vanished. They were no longer a scandal. They were a story. The following Sunday, they faced the town. Lillian put on her best dress, the simple blue one she had first arrived in, now mended and clean. Caleb wore a clean shirt, his face freshly shaven. As they walked toward the small white church at the end of the street, Lillian's steps faltered. Every instinct told her to run, to hide. Caleb stopped and took her arm, his grip firm and reassuring. "Together," he said. They walked through the doors and down the central aisle. A hush fell over the congregation. Every eye was on them. Lillian could feel the weight of their stares, the heavy burden of their collective memory. She kept her chin held high, her gaze fixed forward, and did not stumble. They sat in a pew in the middle of the church, a silent declaration that they were not there to hide in the back. Pastor Gable, his face older and perhaps a little wiser, did not falter in his service. When it was time for his sermon, he opened his Bible and read a passage about a woman who was brought before a crowd, accused of sin. He spoke of judgment and of mercy. He spoke of the heavy stones that people carry and of the grace required to set them down. He never once looked at Caleb and Lillian, but every word was for them. Lillian sat perfectly still, the tears streaming down her face. They were not tears of shame or sorrow, but of release. The judgment she had carried for so long, the heavy stone of her own past, was finally being lifted. She was not being pardoned by the town. She was being allowed to pardon herself. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright morning sun, Caleb took her hand and led her to the church steps. There, in front of the whole town, in front of the gossips and the righteous, the curious and the kind, he turned to her. He gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, and then he kissed her. It was not the secret, silencing kiss of that first sunset. It was a kiss in the full, brilliant light of dawn. It was a public declaration, a claiming, a final, unassailable truth. It was a new beginning. The final scene is not of that day, but of years later. The sun is setting, casting a long golden light over the rebuilt ranch. The pastures are green, dotted with healthy cattle. A new wing has been added to the cabin, the fresh lumber of its walls smelling of pine and promise. Caleb stands on the porch, his arm around Lillian. He is older now, the lines on his face deeper, a touch of gray at his temples. The stiffness is still in his shoulder, but he stands tall and straight. Lillian leans against him, her face serene, content. She rests a hand on her stomach, a gentle, protective gesture over the slight swell of a new life beginning within her. They are not the broken, haunted people who fled into the desert. They are scarred, yes, but they are whole. No past can ruin us, he says, his voice a low, sure rumble as he looks out over the land they have reclaimed together. Only fear, and we're done with fear. Thank you for being a part of our story today. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts in English.